Hi all! In this mini lecture we discuss the subject of Christopher Columbus' experiences in a new world. Portugal's Spanish neighbors had long been interested in overseas expansion, just as the Portuguese had also been. By Columbus's time, however, Spain had lagged far behind. Spanish shipbuilders and sailors were as competent as those of Portugal, and some Spanish nobles and merchant families had been tied to early African trade. But what distinguished Spain's overseas ventures from Portugal's was the stronger tendency by the Spanish to acquire large land masses by force. Spain then colonized those land masses with large numbers of settlers and forced Catholicism on all inhabitants. This pattern was derived to an extent from the centuries-long Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula that ended with the defeat of the Muslim Caliphate of Granada in 1492. Interestingly, as if it was fated, it was at Ferdinand and Isabella's royal military encampment, Santa Fe de Granada, that Columbus received his license to sail across the ocean sea. This was then the name that they had given to the Atlantic Ocean. Christopher Columbus was born in the Italian city-state of Genoa in 1451. Right here is the Republic of Genoa. This was just one of many ambitious merchants who came of age in the dynamic commercial world of 15th century Lisbon. So he was born in Genoa but grew up in Lisbon. Columbus spent most of his time sailing on Portuguese merchant vessels to West Africa, England, and even Iceland, but he became obsessed with a scheme to sail west to China and Japan. He had read about both places in the 200-year-old account of Marco Polo. So in about 1485 he left for Spain, where eventually he received the sponsorship of Ferdinand and Isabella. By 1492, as we know, he was sailing across the Atlantic, seeking the successors of Kublai Khan. On October 12, 1492, Columbus and his mostly Spanish crew made contact with the native Taino inhabitants of Guanahani. This was one of the smaller Bahama Islands. So this larger map here is the different Bahama Islands north of Cuba. And right here is the island previously known as Guanahani. Columbus himself, he thought himself somewhere near Japan, or at least, as he wrote, east of India. So he christened the island San Salvador, Holy Savior, as a religious gesture of thanks. And if you look very closely on your map, you'll see that this island is in fact labeled San Salvador. He then called the native Bahamians and all other indigenous he later met in the region, quote, Indians, unquote. He deemed the Bahamians to be tall, well-built, scantily clad, and ignorant of iron weapons. So in other words, he figured they'd make excellent slaves, like the Canary Islanders. And eventually he shipped 500 Caribbean natives to the slave markets of Seville. After the Bahamas, Columbus sailed southwest to Cuba and then east to Haiti. He renamed Haiti Española, Little Spain, which in English is often rendered as Hispaniola. Throughout this and his subsequent 3 voyages, Christopher Columbus claimed and named everything and everyone he met for his royal Spanish sponsors. He continually reiterated his hopes of finding gold, spices, and news of the Great Khan. He actually died in 1506, still believing he was somewhere near China. For the diverse American peoples who met Columbus and his crew, the result could be little more than mixed feelings. These newcomers from Europe brought some useful goods, including hatchets and sewing needles, but their incessant demands for gold, food, and sexual companionship simply could not be met. The result was violence, torture, rape, and murder of native islanders at will. Some frustrated Taino eventually responded with similar violence, but the result for them were vengeance raids organized by the far better armed colonists. In the most extreme cases, native women actually killed their own children and then themselves to avoid being assaulted and raped. Columbus was continually seeking China and gold, but the natives he met were more interested in a copper-gold alloy than in pure gold. To Columbus, that meant they must be, quote, natural slaves, unquote, ignorant of commerce and price. The islands also lacked anything Columbus recognized as a religious building, for example, a church, a synagogue, or a mosque. These were actually the only three types of religious building with which Columbus was familiar. Because he did not see any such building, he presumed that the Taino and other Bahamians lacked religion and viewed his arrival as divinely ordained. He claimed that the Native Americans, and that especially his Taino allies, needed him for religious indoctrination, for instruction in work and trade, and for physical protection. This protection was necessary due to a group that Columbus deemed, quote, evil Indians, unquote. These were a second Haitian society, the chronic enemies of the Taino. They were called the Caribe, apparently an ethnic term from which we get Caribbean. They inhabited the smaller islands to the south and east of a large island known as Borinquen, which was renamed by the Spanish Rich Port, or Puerto Rico. Reputedly, the Caribe, which we often hear rendered as Caribs, had a bad habit of eating human flesh. However, we should note that the notion of man-eating natives is just the sort of allegation that medieval travelers leveled at newly encountered peoples, both for sensationalism and for a sense of superiority. In this case, Columbus apparently blended two Latin words, canis for dog, or rather one Latin word, canis for dog, and the local ethnic name Caribe to produce what came out as a new word, cannibal. Carib and cannibal soon became interchangeable in the lexicon of Spanish conquest, and the image of a cannibal stuck fast in European imagination, whether or not it was actually true. In fact, evidence on this practice by the so-called Caribs is unclear. But to Columbus and his allies, what mattered was the Taino report of cannibal Caribs. This provided a pretext to be the important police that protected the Taino from their neighbors. It also provided a pretext to dominate the region, imposing his own interpretations on the social and cultural patterns of these New World peoples. Those interpretations were simply seen as justifying European domination. Spanish sovereignty in the Americas soon was defined against a backdrop of Portuguese claims. In 1494, the Spanish and the Portuguese, with papal support, split the world into two influence zones. This was encoded in the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas terms established that the Spanish ruled everyone living 370 leagues, which is roughly 1,110 miles or more west of the Canary Islands, and all inhabitants in that region were, as a result of the treaty, now subjects of the Spanish crown. Africa and Asia, and eventually Brazil, which was not known until 1500, then fell to the Portuguese. The papal role in the Treaty of Tordesillas reflected the European view of the Pope's power as above that of secular rulers. More importantly, though, it also reflected the papal role in the spread of Christianity through European overseas expansion. This was a critical component of the eventual European colonization that would occur throughout the globe.